Welcome to The Humble Podcaster, the podcast where we help you follow through on your dreams of creating your own show by providing practical knowledge, tips, and tricks on podcast production. I'm your host, Chris Hill, and on this episode, we're going to dive into how to create an effective trailer for your podcast, as well as developing the most important part of your podcast structure, the body. In our last episode, we talked about developing your intro and outro. I hope you've done your homework and have that ready to go, because it's going to inform what we do with the trailer for your podcast. So why do we need a trailer for the podcast now? I mean, we don't have a full-fledged show yet, so what is there to preview? When I think of a trailer, I think of a preview for content that has already been created. Something like, in a world where podcasts don't exist. Not content that has yet to be created. The reason is twofold. First of all, it satisfies a key requirement for getting your podcast live. You must have audio published on your podcast host, aka your RSS feed, in order to register the podcast with any podcast directory. This is true for Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts. They must detect the MP3 before you can register the audio. And this process takes time. Spotify is the fastest and is almost instant, so there are no worries there, but Apple and Google can take up to 3, maybe even 5 days to verify and put your podcast onto their platform. I learned early on in my podcast production career that it was a terrible, terrible idea to try and promote a show as released, quote unquote, on the day you registered the show with a particular podcast directory. There's no way you can promote a show as live on Apple without a link, right? So I quickly pivoted to a model to ensure that we don't have awkward, we're live on the podcast host and nowhere else for a week feeling that just sucks the momentum out of a launch. Prior to Apple and other hosts allowing you to have a trailer, I would have my clients do a show where they talked about why they're doing what they're doing and something simple and short that we could release without having to promote a particular guest or cover a topic in detail. And when trailers became important, we pivoted to those because they are even simpler and faster to produce. Plus, once you have the trailer up, it'll be pinned to the top of your podcast page on any major podcast directory. So it's one of the first things that new listeners will hear when they check out your show. Trailers are important because they represent what you want from your show in the beginning. They attract people to your content and give them a place to preview the show you're looking to create. So what goes into a trailer? Remember that intro you wrote and the music you picked? That's our starting point. From there, I want you to expound upon your one-sentence description for the show. Then we'll wrap with the outro you wrote. If you're looking for an example, go check out the trailer for this podcast and give it a listen. All said, the target length for a trailer is about 1 minute. In terms of writing, that should be no more than 150 words. That's all you need. You're welcome to make it longer, but thinking beyond your first few episodes, remember this will be a preview for your show as a whole. That leads me to the second reason you need a trailer. It's essentially a sales pitch for why you should care and subscribe to the show. People are going to sample this to get a sense for what your show is, and then choose whether to listen or not. So make sure your message is concise and compelling. As you continue to produce your show, please don't forget that once upon a time you created a trailer. This is something you should absolutely revisit. Your recording and editing skills will definitely improve with time, and your messaging may get altered as you go forward. So I suggest refreshing your trailer at least once a year to keep it current. Remember that people will see this pinned to the top of your podcast page on every major directory. So keep it sounding good and matching the content you're distributing. And speaking of the content you're distributing, it's time I let you in on a little secret. Well, it's not much of a secret, it's more of an open secret, but it's the secret to success on the internet. It has nothing to do with going viral, by the way. It has everything to do with being consistent. Consistency is one of the most important elements of your podcast. It's almost subconscious in its influence, but it makes a difference in how you're perceived. Take my comment from the last episode about Dan Carlin. There might have been some salt in those words. Honestly, I wish he'd deliver more consistent content, but I understand why he can't, and I definitely agree that quality trumps shipping when you're discussing historical events. But let's be honest here, most of us aren't Dan Carlin, and even Dan has circumvented this problem by creating his own secondary podcast where he is more regular. It's called Hardcore History, Addendum. There'll be a link to it in the show notes if you want to check it out. As the saying goes, consistency breeds results. And consistency is one of the best ways to develop authenticity. Sticking by your words and showing up, even when it's not fun, will show people you care about the work you create, and that the ideals you espouse are more than just words. To that end, Seth Godin wrote a great blog post along those lines called Defining Authenticity, which I highly recommend you read. Sometimes just showing up and doing the work can be really tough. It's not always fun to edit your own words, to edit your own voice, even as I mentioned in last week's episode. Again, this whole process feels really meta for me, but it's tough. You know, if you read the newsletter last week, just going on with the meta theme, you'll know that last week's episode came out a little late. I actually started early on it, but I put off recording until the night before. And at about 3 a.m., I decided it was better to catch a few hours of sleep so that I didn't come away with a technical and typo-riddled mess of a product. And so I got some sleep. Sure, the show came out a tad later than I would have liked, but I got it out on the day I committed to getting it out on, and honestly, with not that much of a time difference on the release for the end user than they would normally see. But it felt like a hustle. And before you go, are you pod fading already? No, I'm definitely not. I'm just trying to find a rhythm that works with writing and producing the show. And note to self, hitting record at 11:30 p.m. the night before is not feasible. And for what it's worth, I'm recording this on a Friday as opposed to a Monday night, so I think I'm getting better at this. Introspective navel gazing aside, consistency in podcasting isn't just about getting your show out on time. It's about having a format that your audience can become familiar with. And for that, let's have a look at the body of your show. For this piece of production, I know many folks will say, I'm just doing an interview show. I could just wing it. Please don't be that person. Sure, you can have some great conversations on the fly, and there are people talented enough to keep a show going this way, but if you're listening to this, I'm guessing this is your first show. This may even be the first time you've recorded an interview, and I implore you, please come prepared. You'll be glad you did. The same thing applies to solo and narrative content. You want structure. When creating content becomes challenging, you'll be glad you have it. Research appropriately. Create outlines, and then build out your show. It's the same basic stuff you were taught in school when you made your first book report. It's just way more advanced than writing a report on where the wild things are. I consider the body of a show to be a two-part problem to solve. The first challenge is the segments within your show. If you're doing an interview-styled podcast, for instance, introduction to the guest, the interview, and a wrap-up. When deciding how many segments you'll need, I recommend that you rely on the research you've done with other podcasts. What do you like? What do you not like? Did you get any audience feedback about things that you don't like within a show? Take all those factors into account along with the ever-important question, do I have time to do all this? And then establish your show's segments. The second challenge you'll have is the content for each segment. Going along with the segments we've established in our example, if your first section is a guest introduction, then you'll need to decide how you want to introduce each guest on your show. Will you do your own research on their background, or will they be responsible for providing you with their bio? Perhaps a bit of both? Once you have this decided upon, you'll have a framework for the guest introduction done. This is great because once you've done a few of them, you'll have a cadence for how to produce future segments. Going along with the segments we outlined above, the next piece is going to be your interview. This is going to be the core of your show, and so you need to make sure you're prepared for it. Much like the introduction to the guest, you'll need to have an outline for what you want to discuss. Depending on your show, this outline may vary with each new episode, or it may stay the same. Regardless, I always recommend you do your homework and know something about your guests before they come on your show. That might sound obvious right now, but 30 episodes in, 40, 50, 60 episodes in, you're going to feel like you have the hang of things and you may forget, so it's always good to be reminded. This will inform your questions as well and help you be prepared for a good conversation. In addition, I always recommend a set of stock questions that you can fall back on during an interview. I also recommend structuring them in a way that helps you tell the story you want to tell with each guest. If you don't know where to begin, the hero's journey is a great model for this. I'll include a link to it in the show notes. If the hero's journey doesn't fit with your show or your style, then I recommend coming up with 20 questions that you can ask any guest. The goal here is to ensure you keep the conversation going. You may rarely need these questions, but they'll keep you going the right direction should you need them. Lastly, the wrap-up segment is where you need to think through how you want to end each show. This is handy in an interview-style show because you can have a nice signal to the guest that the conversation is ending. If you're worried about talking too long, this is your brake lever. This is also where you'll put the famed last question of the show, which is typically one of the most important questions you can ask. Why is it so important? Because this is one of the guaranteed things you'll ask during the show. It's consistency for the listener. It also ensures you somehow manage to tie all the content together and focus your show back on your core messaging. If there's one question you want to make sure you get right in every show, it's this one. Alternatively, if you're doing a solo or narrative show, this segment is where you can signify to the listener that the episode is almost over. It's a consistent anchor for your content as well. It's your chance to summarize the content and let the listener know what to expect in the next episode. All of this will take some time to put together and decide upon, of course, which means it's time for me to signal the end of this episode with some homework. For your homework, if you find yourself getting stuck in this phase, I recommend picking a show you like and seeing how they break up their show. Listen to 2 or 3 episodes and take some notes. Track their outline and see how they break up the show. This will hopefully inspire you to do the same thing, or at least give you an idea of how you want to do your show. If you've got segments ready to go and the content decided upon, then great, awesome. Also, it's at this point that you should be ready to record and launch your podcast, or almost ready anyways. If you've got the gear and are feeling confident, then by all means, go ahead and start recording your intro, outro, and trailer. You can even jump into the first episode to get a feel for production. And if you're not ready yet, or just want to get through this series before diving in, that's fine too. In fact, in our next episode, we're going to be covering some basic tips for recording a show, editing, and finally, launching your podcast. Thank you for listening to The Humble Podcaster. You can keep up with the latest on the podcast at humblepodcaster.com, and be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to connect with us on social media, you can find us at HumblePod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And remember, stay humble, stay on course, and keep on podcasting. This has been a HumblePod production. Stay humble.